We're taking some time now to bring our focus back to children. It's easy to get caught up in the theoretical components of literature in childhood, but let's not forget who children's literature is really about. When we talk about responding to literature, we're talking about the ways actual kids select and think about books. And this gets a little dicey because, as we've talked about before, kids are not some uniform category. We can look at trends and theories about response, but there is no way to definitively say what any particular child or group of children will like. Still, responses to literature are hugely important topics, especially to educators. And in a multimedia digital environment, there are many education professionals, parents, librarians, publishers, and booksellers who want to know what kids like so that they can recommend and create literature that meets those needs. For the purposes of this conversation, we're going to look at a quick definition of response, and then we'll talk about the various factors that influence responses, a few theories of response, and some ways of responding. So let's begin with a definition of response. That's really any outward sign that a person is inwardly engaging with the literature. It's anything they say or do that reveals what they think about a literary experience. So a picture drawn of a favorite character is just as much a response as a New York Times book review. It's any sign of engagement. There are plenty of factors that influence response, and it's important to remember that we can't predict what responses will be based on those factors. The main thing is that they do seem to influence the books children choose and enjoy. They are age, gender identification, literary features, and social and environmental influences. The most obvious determinant of children's interest patterns is age. The books younger children typically choose are much less complex, often featuring lots of pictures, interactive elements, and simple stories. With time, we see increasing interest in more complicated storylines. We also notice that topics of interest change. Younger kids might like stories where animal characters interact with their families or learn lessons. Older children might still like stories about animals, but perhaps in more dramatic situations like Because of Winn-Dixie. We also see big changes in sense of humor. Absurdity and other very blatant forms of humor are popular with young kids, while older children like to see more subtle or even deadpan humor. Some aspects of development also influence changing interest. Board books are more popular with very young children because their pages are easier to turn. Books about changing bodies are more interesting to older children who are physically experiencing those changes. In terms of cognitive development, we find that younger children appreciate books in which they can relate to one character, while older children are more prepared to take on multiple points of view or nonlinear timelines. Language development matters in terms of vocabulary and literary devices. Younger kids tend to like a lot of rhyme, older children might appreciate riddles or wordplay. Development of morality also seems to make a difference. Complex moral questions can be interesting topics of conversation for older children who tend to consider questions of intent and justice, while younger children tend to work within the parameters of adult-defined rules. And finally, we see greater differentiation in literature based on personality characteristics for older children, while books for young kids tend to include less variety because younger children are viewed as having less distinctive personalities. Now, before we really get into gender identification, I do want to make a distinction. This is not about gender essentialism, and by gender essentialism I mean we're not saying that all children born male like one type of book and that all children born female like another type of book. This is a much more nuanced discussion. So many children construct their identities in ways that align to some degree with traditionally masculine or with traditionally feminine characteristics or some combination. And there are parts of traditional masculinity and traditional femininity that include interest in certain topics and particular ways of expressing oneself. So choices about literature as they relate to gender are part of those social constructs. So some studies and surveys find that girls tend to read more, but they tend to limit their reading to more narrow categories. Boys aren't as avid in their reading, but they tend to find a wider variety of books interesting. That does conflict a little with some other studies that show that girls are more likely to read books marketed to a boy demographic than boys are to read books marketed to girls. We also find that boys are more likely to read nonfiction books than girls are. What that ends up meaning is that a lot of boys miss out on great fiction that can help develop empathy, and girls often miss out on a lot of awesome nonfiction on topics in the STEM fields or world history. The physical appearance of books themselves can also affect response. Different children prefer different types or quantities of illustration. Brightly colored books are often chosen because they're eye-catching. Formats can vary widely, including pop-up books, graphic novels, books with accompanying audio, big books, books with small pieces of text interspersed among instructive illustrations. That all has to do with format. The length of a book might determine interest, and even the type of print. Tiny text might appear intimidating to some children, or certain fonts might be difficult for others to read. There are other strong influences that develop in social and physical environments. So one of the reasons we advocate for greater cultural and ethnic diversity in literature is because familiar faces and customs can capture a child's interest. Accessibility is another, maybe more obvious issue. Children with access to a wider variety of books tend to read more widely, while children who only get to choose books from an underfunded, outdated library once a week during the school year have narrower and often decreased interest in literature. Attitudes of teachers and caregivers are also important. As the mediators of literature and often the selectors of literature, we could act as positive or negative influences, either encouraging or limiting interest. Peers can also influence book choices. Many teachers find that when a particular book becomes popular, it circulates from student to student within the classroom, and that can also work in the opposite direction. Children might limit their reading choices based on the comments of their peers. Before we move on from this topic, I want to make a quick note that we really are dealing with a cycle here. As publishers and booksellers note trends, they take that data and produce more literature that fits those parameters. So while it may be true that, for example, older children are more likely to choose literature based on their own personality development and interests, we must also consider that publishers don't produce literature for younger children with a wide variety of personality considerations because of the data they've collected. So is it possible that young children might differentiate their choices more if there were more books written for them that filled that need? Maybe. The market both responds to and influences literary preferences. Now let's talk about theories of response. There are literally hundreds of them, all drawing from disciplines as diverse as psychology, linguistics, aesthetics, literature and education, marketing, and more. And they all rest on different assumptions about meaning. Some focus on the literature, others focus on the readers themselves. Some examine cultural or social aspects of response, others look at individual personalities. There could be a whole course in and of itself on all of these theories, but what we're going to do is focus on the areas where they overlap. So Kiefer and Tyson point out, all categories of reader response research focus on the reader's textual knowledge and experience, but they are embedded within larger social and cultural contexts. What that means is that whenever we talk about response, we're looking at what the interplay of the literary experience does with a reader's life experience. We're putting that all inside the broader social and cultural space where it's happening. So, there are a few baseline assumptions that all theories of response have in common. First, that the process of reading and responding is an active one. Words and pictures are not directly piped into the brain. Instead, each reader's experience is shaped by what he or she already knows and believes. Second, response is dynamic. That means that a response can change with mediation, reflection, or rereading. Third, we respond to literature differently depending on what we want to get out of it. For example, we read and respond to recipes differently than we read and respond to fiction or to poetry. Finally, we're going to look at ways of responding to literature. Response can be formal, as in a book report or academic paper, or it can be informal, as in a recommendation to a friend or colleague. Response can be direct, as when a child specifically comments on the actions of a character, or it can be indirect, as when she casually references a book character or incorporates it into her play. Responses can be verbal, like a response to a question or writing prompt, or they can be nonverbal, in the form of art or drama. All types of response are valid, though formal, direct, and verbal or written responses are often favored in classroom settings. Still, when facilitating response, it can be advantageous to encourage informal, indirect, and nonverbal responses as well. Some suggestions are to facilitate response through artwork. Ask readers to illustrate a favorite passage or draw a favorite character. Ask them to draw themselves into a scene as a way of reflecting on their own positionality in relation to the text. Readers might also respond through drama. Choose a key theme from the book, and on the count of 3, ask everyone in the room to strike a pose that encapsulates it. Ask them to act out a scene from the story, or write a scene from a different perspective. Storytelling can also be very effective. Ask a reader to retell a story or part of the story. Consider providing props and costumes to invite young readers to incorporate elements of the book into their play. Okay, that's the basics. But just as a reminder, responses to literature are as diverse as readers themselves. There are tons of factors influencing choice, and as mediators, we can harness some of that knowledge to help readers broaden their horizons and to engage more deeply with the books and media they select.